When it comes to domestic violence, we've gotten only half the story. Male victims of domestic violence have been systematically ignored and marginalized. Most people don't even think they exist. This has happened due to advocates in the media telling half the story, and only half the story. The story that's been told focuses exclusively on female victims and leaves out men and boys, even though there's an abundance of evidence from both research and clinical data that men and boys comprise a significant portion of the victims of domestic violence. When we're told half the story, we're left with a distorted view. Just imagine if you were told the story of Cinderella, but the part about the glass slipper was omitted. You'd be left with a distorted picture of the story, right? That's exactly what has happened with domestic violence. Here's a fact sheet from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, one of the nation's oldest and largest domestic violence organizations, and the voice of the 50 state domestic violence coalitions that guide domestic violence policies and services in the U.S. It's meant to teach the public about domestic violence. Notice that it clearly states that there were 1.3 million female victims of domestic violence. It refers to a research study to back up this claim. Now, let's look at the research that they used. Sure enough, we can see there were 1.3 million female victims. But wait a minute. This study, the same one that's quoted in the above fact sheet, lists both male and female victims, and it shows that there were also 835,000 male victims of domestic violence. The fact sheet never told that part of the story. Why would they leave out such an important finding? Why not state that there were 1.3 million female victims and 835,000 male victims of domestic violence? Or even total the two and say there are over 2 million victims of domestic violence in the U.S. But somehow, the male half of the story is never mentioned. We never see the glass slipper. Now, the NCADV is far from the only offender using this practice. Omitting male victims of domestic violence is very common. There are an estimated 600 sites on the internet that quote the same half of the story about 1.3 million females and then say nothing about the male half. I urge you to search the phrases and see for yourself. Male victims simply don't exist according to these sites. They quote only their preferred half of the research findings. Respected researcher Murray Strauss of the University of New Hampshire's Family Research Laboratory has said that national surveys and other studies have shown equal rates of violence by men and women since as early as 1984. But this evidence is typically ignored, concealed, and often explicitly denied by the academic community. More recently, CDC's National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, in conjunction with the National Institute of Justice and the Department of Defense, launched the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. Now, this was touted as a landmark study that would gauge the status of domestic violence in the United States. Guess what they found? They found that 53% of the victims of interpersonal violence in the U.S. were men. Let me say that again. They found that 53% of the victims of domestic violence were men. They also found that over 40% of the victims of severe interpersonal violence were men. Just look at these tables from the NISVS for domestic violence victims in the last 12 months. Table 4.1 is about the women and estimates that 4,741,000 women were victims of domestic violence in the last 12 months. Then look at Table 4.2 that shows the same stats, but for the men. It clearly estimates that 5,365,000 men were victims. Total these two and you get a little over 10 million. 5.3 million is clearly 53%. That makes men the majority of domestic violence victims, and yet all we hear is silence. In fact, to make matters worse, the only place this male majority is mentioned is in the full report. The executive summary doesn't say anything. Glass slipper. The letter to professionals doesn't say anything. Another glass slipper. The fact sheets don't say anything. Yet another glass slipper. In fact, some of these say just the opposite. They claim that women are disproportionately victims of domestic violence. The CDC is clearly telling only half the story. I've written to CDC asking for clarification, and they have yet to respond. You might be asking what happens to all these male victims. Since our domestic violence services are built for women, do men find help and services? The answer is a resounding no. Look at this chart, which shows the number of women and children who used emergency services in shelters, and then the men. Obviously, the men are not finding services when they're in need. According to the research previously noted, men are over half of the victims, and yet they are only about 2/3 of 1% of those who are getting help. Something is terribly wrong here. And what happens to these men when they do seek services? The 2011 research of Douglas and Hines shows us that when men are victims of domestic violence and they go in search of treatment to a domestic violence agency, they run into a buzzsaw. About 80% of the males were told that the services were for women only. 15% reported they were made fun of. 63% were referred to a batterer's program with the implication that the help seeker was the batterer. And 95% of the men surveyed felt that the services were biased against men. It's time that we started telling the entire story of domestic violence for both men and women. At this point, men are facing hardship and discrimination that's the result of our legislators being ignorant of half the story and funding discriminatory laws and services that are paid for by our taxes. It's time they heard the rest of the story. Please send the link to this video to your congressman and senator today and ask them just where would they send these men for help. And, as always, keep in mind, men are good.